Today in McDonaldland News, Mount McDonaldland is experiencing thick volcanic shake activity. So try the new Mount McDonaldland shake when you order the McDonaldland meal with your very own character souvenir kit.
A McDonald's, in McDonaldland, get the McDonaldland meal in McDonaldland.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
This episode is brought to you by Espolón Tequila. Slow, sticky, snoozy. They call these the dog days of summer. But Espolón? They don't do boring. Welcome to the Marg Days. Espolón Tequila. 100% blue Weber agave, born to shake up your summer. Just add lime, agave, and a little attitude. Visit espolontequila.com. Espolón Tequila, 40% alcohol, volume 80 proof. Copyright 2025 Campari America, New York, New York. Drink responsibly.
This episode is brought to you by Wayfair. Podcasts follow us everywhere. Whether you're cooking in the kitchen, chilling in the living room, or pretending to fold laundry in the bedroom. And with Wayfair, every one of those rooms can tell a story of its own. Their curated collections of furniture styles and prices make Wayfair the trusted destination to turn your home into your happy place. Shop everything home at wayfair.com with free and easy delivery straight to your door.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Mackay, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at Burned by Books. Let's start the show. In Nell Stevens' latest novel of forgeries and hoaxes of art and people, The Original, her protagonist Grace has found herself living with her wealthy and cold aunt and uncle in an estate in Oxfordshire. The child of a family riven by mental illness, Grace finds comfort in learning to paint elaborate, convincing copies of famous works of art by Velázquez, Van Eyck, and others. When her one friend and confidant in the house, her cousin Charles, goes missing at sea, Grace will suffer the double trauma of his absence and then, quite suddenly, his reappearance years later. A man so physically unlike her cousin that it can only be the man himself, for no other would claim the name on such shallow grounds. The new Charles, a copy with some passing knowledge of his family, will strike up a different kind of relationship with Grace. As secret keepers, the two will begin to interrogate the value of copies, both in the art that Grace forges to create a source of income outside the family, and in the seeming hoax that Charles continues to perpetrate regarding the family fortune, despite all evidence attesting to his fakery. A novel of the 19th century, Nell Stevens describes a world of vibrant colors and palettes, paying attention to the ways in which art sees through the veneers of polite society. In her hands, Grace's copies emerge as testaments to her own struggle to reveal herself as the original, the unvarnished real thing. The Original manages its hoax plot with a building intensity while introducing us to characters so fully drawn as to step from the page. Certainly one of the best novels of the year, The Original has offered a new chapter in a historical hoax that continues to baffle and amaze. Nell Stevens is an award-winning author of memoir and fiction. Her work has been awarded the Somerset Maugham Award, longlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize, and shortlisted by the BBC National Short Story Award. She is the author of 2 novels, The Original and Briefly, A Delicious Life, and 2 memoirs, Bleaker House and Mrs. Gaskell and Me. Her writing is published in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Vogue, The Paris Review, The New York Review of Books, The Guardian, Granta, and elsewhere. Nell is an associate professor of creative writing at the University of Warwick. Nell lives in Oxfordshire with her wife and 2 children. A very much welcome to Burned by Books, Nell Stevens.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that incredible introduction to the novel, which we were just discussing beforehand is really quite hard to sum up. And that was one of the most beautiful efforts I've experienced. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That means a lot to me because it is, and one of its great appeals as a novel is that it's just complicated. It has so many interwoven ideas and plots and subplots and developments. And it just, I really was stunned by it. And in part, I sort of guessed that it might have to do with the original hoax of I think is it the Tichborne family? Is that right?
Yes, that's it.
And I happened to write my first chapter of my dissertation using the Jorge Borges story, The Improbable Imposter Tom Castro, to think about literary hoaxes.
Oh,
So
amazing. Yeah.
it had this kind of wonderful double pleasure for me in returning to that story. But I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about how you decided to pick back up this story that for Borges clearly sort of just boggled him and produced this wonderful fiction, and to return to it and make a richer and much more extended fictionalization of it.
Yeah, I mean, I have quite a complicated relationship to this story, which is kind of one of those stories that if you know about it, you think everyone knows about it. And if you haven't heard about it, it seems bizarre.
Mm.
But it's re-entered public consciousness in the past year because of Zadie Smith's novel, The Fraud, which came out last year, which maybe we can talk about too. But
Yeah.
I first came across this story that is kind of referred to in shorthand as the Tichborne claimant in quite an odd place. I was in the Falklands where I was researching my first book, which was Bleaker House. And I was sitting in the archives, the National Archives of the Falkland Islands in Stanley, which is a tiny box of a room, very, very rarely visited, I would say. And I was really just searching for stories because I wasn't quite sure why I was there. I knew I wanted to write something about the Falklands. I was going through the archives and I found this letter from the 19th century from a British lawyer to the then governor of the Falkland Islands asking about the identity of a man who was rumoured to be living alone on an outlying Falkland island, and asking whether he might be the missing heir of this wealthy British family, the Tichborne family. And that was my first encounter with this story. And I was so taken with it, even just that one letter. And of course, it turns out that wasn't their missing heir, and their missing heir, Roger Tichborne, was almost certainly dead and had died in a shipwreck. But what then went on to happen in the years following the letter that I had read was that this man returns to the family and claims to be the missing heir, and he is nothing like the original Roger physically and in all sorts of ways implausible.
And there's daguerreotypes of the two.
Right, yeah.
And you look at them and they just couldn't be more. They're like on some kind of like continuum line of human physical appearance. They are on opposite ends, I think.
Completely unlike. I mean, the most distinctive thing about the imposter, the claimant, is that he's extremely large. He's a really, really fat man. And the depiction of the original Roger Tichborne is of quite a slight man. But they did, at the time, these almost proto-Photoshop attempts to merge the two photos and see, they were really trying to see, what if you lay one on top of the other? Is it possible that this could be the same man? And it is fascinating, in part because the reason that this claimant was taken seriously predominantly is because his mother, Roger Tichborne's mother, accepted him as her son, which is just extraordinary to think about and was so fascinating to me. And I had sat with this story for so long and begun writing this, what the book that is now the original. It had lots of false starts and then a proper start. And I'd sent them to my agent who was shopping it around, and she called me and said, I've just pitched your novel to an editor and I need you to sit down. And what does this say about my psychology? I assumed that she had really, really good news for me.
Wow, I would not
I
have
don't know
assumed
what she's
that.
done, but my life is about to change. I was pitching it to an editor who said in a very confused voice, "Wait a minute, isn't this the new Zadie Smith?"
God,
Which was how I found out about the
devastating.
Yeah. And at the time, the novel had a different title. It was originally, my novel was called The Copyist.
Mm.
And Zadie Smith's novel is called The Fraud. And this sparked quite a large crisis for me until I read Zadie's novel, and it is a completely different project.
Yes, yeah.
But it did change my book for many, many ways for the better, including the title, because I thought I cannot publish a book the year after Zadie Smith on the same subject and call mine The Copyist.
Well, you could, but
I could have, but I much prefer the original. And as titles do, it then angled the content of what I was producing to be different in I think, a better way.
I'm just going to, even though I've had the good fortune of meeting Zadie and having dinner with her and love her work. The original is a better book than the
Thank you.
Fraud. And I really like your project, having known this particular hoax quite well. So I'm very pleased that you published it.
Very validating to hear. Thank you very much. I mean, but it was a strange experience for me reading The Fraud, because there's a moment, and I think it's probably does not loom large for most readers of The Fraud, but there's a moment where she talks about a fake painting in it. And I kind of got to that moment and thought, what is about to happen? It's really just a glancing kind of thematic flourish in The Fraud. But it did strike me as really interesting that there is something about the Tichborne claimant that sends us into these questions about authenticity in all these different areas of life and art.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the other thing that happened while I was writing this novel related to the Tichborne claimant was a kind of barrage of Tichborne adjacent stories coming out. I don't know if you've seen, it's a French film called The Origin of Evil.
No.
Which is extraordinary if you're thinking about Tichborne stories. It's the story of a woman showing up at a family's house and claiming to be their estranged daughter. And it gradually, I'm going to spoil it for you. May I spoil it for you?
Spoil it, yeah, please.
I guess it's obvious where I'm going with this if I say it's a Tichborne story. She's the real estranged daughter is in jail, and this is her ex-girlfriend who's coming to trial. And there was, even stories like Saltburn.
Oh, yeah. Very adjacent.
Like turning over this similar material. And they all came out in this period when I was writing this book. So it's one of those things, isn't it, where these things cluster. But it did feel particularly ironic, I suppose, that a book about copying is coming out at this moment when we're all sort of telling this story over and over again in different ways.
Grace's story is one that will be in some ways recognizable to readers of Victorian literature. That of the orphan, mother dead and father institutionalized and will eventually die, a spoiler, sent to live with an aunt and uncle of wealth. I wonder if you would read us a section from the beginning of the novel that introduces us to this enormous transition in Grace's life and way of being after she's sent to live with her relatives.
I absolutely will. At my parents' house, I'd spoken to everyone in the same manner. My parents, the same as the vicar, the same as the maid, the same as the rag and bone men who used to come by with items they'd stolen from the people in town, the same as the travelling players who arrived in the village once a year to perform an inscrutable drama that referenced variously Julius Caesar, Jesus feeding the multitude, and some satire about local politicians. I was taught no rules in this regard, except the rule of being generally a pleasant person who did not trouble others and who was untroubled by them. I had not known before I moved to Inderwick Hall that to see the family lawyer emerge from a consultation with my aunt and say, "Why are you so sweaty? Have you been running, or are you sick?" would be considered an affront. I had been accustomed, too, to moving freely, eating what I liked whenever I was hungry, reading the books my father brought home from his library club as soon as he was finished with them, and sleeping in the same bed as my mother, though I had my own room down the hall. I was not at all used to the rhythms of the new house, which ran almost despite its inhabitants, and to which we were all expected to succumb. After dinner, when the men moved to the library and the women to the green room, the table was cleared. Later, before the staff retired to bed, it was laid out for breakfast. The sun rose. Food was brought into the dining room, set out. The family arrived, ate. Later, the food was cleared away, crumbs swept, smears and stains wiped, eggshells and apple cores bucketed for the pigs. The table was laid for lunch. Food was brought in, set out. The family arrived, ate. The table was cleared and then laid for dinner. The sun went down. Food was brought in. The family ate. The men moved to the library, the women to the green room. And on my first day in the house, having been awake and terrified all night, I slept through breakfast, then wandered into the kitchen mid-morning and asked the cook for an apple. This was reported to my aunt and uncle, who reacted as though I had casually asked for a dagger in order to drive it through their hearts. When I passed the cook in the entrance hall the following day, I did not recognize her. She had taken off her cap and apron and appeared to me, without them, an entirely new person. She asked if I had been sufficiently fed that day in a tone I did not understand was sarcastic, And I answered, as I would have answered my parents or a rag and bone man or a lawyer, that I was not hungry just then, and thanked her for asking. This too was reported. This too was mad. I simply never knew who anybody was. Not a problem for me, but newly horrifying, separated as I was from my mother, who I only then realised had ushered me through my encounters with the world while whispering a running commentary. Here comes our friend, Mr. Wainthrop, and look, let's wave to that kind gentleman who helped your father mend the gate. And see, here is the doctor just leaving church. Without her, I was at sea. I began to creep through the house, furtive as a rodent, sticking to its quietest places and keeping my head down for fear I would encounter a strange face in the hallway, which might be a stranger, but might be a cousin, might be a servant who the previous day had bathed me, might be a friend of the family who had given me a birthday present, and disgraced myself with blankness. I missed my parents hotly and angrily, and at the same time began to fear that if they came to rescue me, I would not know who they were. But there was Charles, who was distinctive to me long before the others were, because he was the only one who smiled. Charles, who had come to understand the ways in which I was and was not mad, was and was not any madder than anybody else in our family, and who had, after a time, begun of his own accord to whisper when we were together, "And here is Mrs. Arthur, who is the new cook, and who asked you yesterday whether you liked carrots. And here comes Mr. Williams in a bright blue coat, who is writing a book about the house. And over there, looking at you sourly, is Mrs. White, who is Martha's dear friend, who has come to stay for the week." I loved him for that, and for other reasons. And now he had returned, and was amongst us, meeting nobody's eye, and shuffling apologetically into rooms through which, as a younger man, he had paraded laughing. Rooms he had once made lighter and brighter and more tolerable. Charles was back, and everyone else went mad.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Buying a car shouldn't eat up your week. That's why Carvana made it convenient. Car buying that fits around your life, not the other way around. You can get pre-qualified for an auto loan in just a couple of minutes and browse thousands of quality car options, all within your terms, all online, all on your schedule. Turn car buying into a few clicks and not a full week's endeavor. Finance and buy your car at your convenience on
Carvana.
Financing subject to credit approval. Additional terms and conditions may apply.
Hellmann's believes they can turn any mayo hater into a lover. So, if you know someone who thinks mayo equals bland, show their taste buds the truth and challenge them to try Hellmann's flavored mayo. With irresistible flavors like Hellmann's spicy mayo, garlic aioli, chipotle, and Italian herb, they'll be eating their words. Challenge haters to try Hellmann's flavored mayo and get them to eat their words. Learn more at hellmanns.com/eatyourwords.
Mamá, papá, mi cuerpo crece a un ritmo alarmante y la ropa que me compren ahora me quedará muy pequeña muy pronto. Pero su billetera no tiene que sufrir por la moda con los precios bajos de la vuelta a clases de Amazon. Amazon, gasta menos, sonríe más.
Thank you so much, Nell. That was really beautiful, and I loved hearing it in your voice.
Thank you.
And I'm very interested in how this is both a kind of introduction to the alienation of leaving her family home for this cold and distant and anonymous new kind of family home, but also it's an attempt to understand what gets called insanity or madness, and how a certain kind of living without the veneers of societal expectation gets coded as madness. And I wonder if you'd talk about that, because Grace is very worried throughout the novel that she will succumb to a kind of family madness.
Yeah, I think there's all sorts of ways that this was something I'm working on in the book. In part, it's to do with any kind of, I guess, the kinds of currency that matter to respectable people at this moment in Victorian England. And that's a behavior as well as literal currency and appearances. And these sorts of structures that people must live within, and the idea of diverting from those in any way being coded as madness, which did happen, right? That was, and many people were institutionalized for reasons that would appall us and should. The other thing that I was thinking about is queerness in the novel, which we haven't talked about yet, but that's a huge part of what I'm thinking through in all of these different ways to do with copying and madness. And Grace's great fear early on is that because she's attracted to women, that is, in fact, madness, that is the sign that she anticipates all the time that she is going to follow the paths her parents have trodden, which is into institutions where they're both institutionalized for genuine mental illness. And she's waiting for it. And her father talks to her about her inheritance at one point. And so she feels that madness is her inheritance, which is another question in the book. It's an inheritance novel, amongst other things. So I'm thinking about what we inherit and in what ways, and who deserves to inherit various kinds of currency.
There's that really terrible moment where he's talking to her about her inheritance, and he has the plate of like toast crumbs and says, "Here's your inheritance."
Which I confess to having absolutely stolen from a friend who gave me permission to steal it, but it happened to her. And it really
happened to her directly. Oh,
yeah.
God. I thought she made it up. Oh, God.
No. She it was something she experienced in her family, and we talked about it a lot, and she allowed me to give it to Grace, for which I'm very grateful. But yes, he comes in and says, I have your inheritance for you. And then he lifts the lid on a dish and it's just crumbs. And she feels really confident in some ways that her inheritance is going to be some kind of insanity, and then interprets two elements of her being as evidence of this. One is her queerness and the other is her face blindness, which was touched on in that extract, and really changes her experience of her social world, particularly when she moves to Indwick Hall and she's essentially friendless there.
And so Charles becomes Grace's one friend and confidant, and he sees her not as mad and not as a copy, but as a developing person. And, with Charles's disappearance, lost potentially at sea, and then return again, an inartful copy of himself, this new Charles will also see Grace, making his copy incredibly valuable to her life and happiness. And I wanted to ask, firstly, did you have any kind of 19th century novels in mind when you were crafting Grace and thinking about her experience of alienation and fear of madness? And secondly, how did you work through the complications of making the new Charles, the copy Charles, operate for Grace as the real one had?
Even hearing you talk about it, Chris, is reminding me the many reasons why this was the only book I've ever written with a spreadsheet.
There must have been.
I am not a spreadsheet person, but this book really befuddles me. And even in kind of trying to just talk about certain strands of the story, I almost want to bring up the color-coded chart and remind myself how it all fits together, because I'm sort of not naturally plot-minded, and this was a real kind of exercise in plot, amongst other things. Grace is, as a character, is a kind of child figure of the 19th century novel, as you describe it. One of the projects in the book was to place a character, Grace, in the 19th century novel and see if I can have her fight her way out of it in some way.
Oh, that's great. I love that.
And part of that is a project of queering it, right? And part of it is to do with these other ideas around copying. And the book, in a way, it's a sort of pastiche, right? It's a sort of copy of a Victorian sensation novel in some ways. There are so many novels that begin with this kind of alienated child. Of course, we think of Jane Eyre, and in particular, I was actually thinking of Mansfield Park quite a lot.
Oh, yeah. I was as well reading it.
Yeah, that was very, very present for me. It's one of my favorite novels, and I think about it a lot. So the new Charles, can we spoil things, or should I?
Yeah, I think so. I think we kind of need to. With a novel like this,
it's very hard to talk about this book without ruining it. So let's wade in.
As long as you don't mind, then I'm okay.
At all. It's a real relief. He's a con artist, essentially, in many, many ways. And one of the projects of the book is to allow these kinds of cons, because Grace too is essentially a con artist. She sells fake art. She copies these paintings, and her project over the course of the novel is to make money. She's really interested in money. She's horrified by it and obsessed with it, and she wants it and she's repelled by it. And the way she wants to make money is to use her one skill, really, which is to copy paintings, and she sells them, and with the implication being that they are then sold as the original. And I'm so interested in copying, particularly copies of art, but also more broadly as a really beautiful human instinct. And so the new Charles, who is a copy and a con artist, one of his skills is in reading people and seeing people. And he immediately sees Grace, in part because he knows about Grace from his own personal history. He does have some details of who she is, but he's also extremely good at reading people and at copying them. And those skills are very linked in the same way that Grace sees art very clearly and can copy it. The new Charles sees people, and seeing clearly and seeing truly is quite prized in this book.
Mm-hmm.
Grace can't see faces clearly. She can't see faces clearly. She cannot distinguish people. And yet she can see art clearly, and she can see other things incredibly clearly. She can see the kind of moral and ethical horrors related to the Inderwick family's wealth incredibly clearly when no one else can.
Mm.
And Charles sees her clearly, not despite, but because he is a con artist, because he is good at copying.
Yeah, so the way in which you take up the copy is perhaps best explained through the fact that you have narrative chapters that are then punctuated by chapters titled Some Truths About Copyists. And they are something like a theory of the copy that sort of then bleeds into the narrative plot. For example, the copyist says, "Do not look at me." The copyist says, "Look at how invisible I am." The copyist says, "Do you love me? Don't you love me? Don't I exist? Do I exist?" What are these kind of theories of the copy performing in the narrative of the plot? And how did your own theory of the copy begin to emerge?
This is one of my great indulgences in this book, and I was so pleased to be allowed to include them. For a moment, I had a brief period of working with an editor who really wanted them gone, and I was allowed to keep them after much.
I don't like that editor one bit.
Well, she left the publisher, so I got my way.
Hopefully she's left editing altogether and is now
in other ways very
doing
brilliant. But
something else.
She wasn't keen on them, and she basically just said, that we don't care about these and they're skippable. And my opinion was, I really don't mind if people skip them. They're very short, but if you want them, they're there for you. And they are, I guess, a theory of copying, a theory of copies. One of the projects I worked on in my doctoral thesis was to do with people's encounters with fake art in Rome in the mid-19th century. And I
Fascinating.
was particularly moved by the diaries of Sophia Peabody Hawthorne, who's Nathaniel Hawthorne's wife, who goes to Rome. She was a copyist.
Huh,
and
I had no idea.
But I mean, a very sort of earnest and unscammy copyist, of course, but she did very, very skilled copies. But she also writes in these diaries about being in Rome of the experience of having looked at art and been moved by it in the way that they really, all of these people that I was reading who visit Rome in this period and encounter art there, they have these extraordinary experiences with what they sort of perceive as authenticity. And they often write about, I feel the hand of the artist on the work. And they have these experiences of huge connection to these great artists whose work they're viewing. And she writes about the experience of having that experience, of having that really, really profound connection with a painting and then discovering later that it was a fake. And it's kind of feeling utterly bereft by that and really shaken. And you can see it's a sort of, it almost shakes her faith that she could have what feels like a sort of spiritual experience and discover that it could not have been what she thought it was. And the other kind of idea that really influenced me a lot was a novel by Hawthorne called The Marble Faun.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Which has a character who's a copyist in it and who I posit was in some ways he's thinking about his wife in this character, where he describes her copying as a spiritual practice and that he has this image of her reaching out and touching the hand of the ghost of the artist and the painting kind of materializing between them. And it's a really, really beautiful way of thinking about copying that really I then kind of ran with the idea that it's actually a kind of act of extreme generosity to copy faithfully, to copy spiritually. And it's about propagation. It's about sharing love in a really genuine way that I find very moving. I'm also one of those people who read Walter Benjamin and will never forget it. And if you want to kind of sit with that with a book, it's all over it. But I think there is so much that's interesting in what we put and don't believe is in copies that might nonetheless be in there. And I find it so interesting to think about why we don't like copies, what we think is missing and what could be missing, what isn't missing really.
Yeah, and I
Grace-
wonder.
Sorry.
I wonder whether you think, Benjamin, thinking about the aura of the work of the original. I mean, I think he would include copyists' work in that, because it's not mechanical reproduction. It's this, as you say, act of generosity in just adding another artist's hand and fingerprints into the aura of that work.
Absolutely. I think, and there's this real distinction that particularly these 19th century writers I was studying around Rome make between spiritual copying and mechanical copying. And there are these essentially workshops in Rome at this period, where they are just churning out copies and copies and copies. And there's a kind of American sculptor and poet called William Wetmore Story who talks about Guido machines and Raphael machines, who are just these copyists who are kind of proto-mechanical in their work, versus the spiritual copyist, the Hilda in the Marble Faun, or how Sophia Peabody Hawthorne thinks about her work. And I, again, thinking about aura, I was so interested in the idea of an aura being something external to the work, but something around it. And I was really interested in the idea of a copy as actually a container, what's inside it, that there is something about meaning being internal that can exist within a copy versus aura as a kind of shell to it. I spent a long time thinking about that, about receptacles versus shells in this thinking through what is and isn't beautiful or meaningful in copies.
One of the things I love about Grace's work as a copyist, as she's kind of making reproductions of these major works of European art in part to make money that would allow her a freedom outside of the constraints of her aunt and uncle's domain, is that she gives each piece such a huge amount of her undivided attention. And what they offer her back is a vision of her life within a society. And this is perhaps most powerfully seen in the Van Eyck painting, the Arnolfini portrait. In copying that work, she understands something essential about marriage and what it would mean for her life to be trapped in that kind of societally sanctioned relationship. And I wonder what your relationship is to this particular portrait. I think it hangs in the National Gallery, and why it is a kind of Rosetta Stone of sorts for Grace, who as a queer person faces the possibility of only being able to live outside of her aunt and uncle's house with a kind of sanctioned imprisonment.
Yeah, it's such a strange painting.
It is. It's really unpleasant in a lot of ways.
It really is. And have you seen it in person ever?
I have, yeah.
Because I had the really strange experience. I must have seen it at some point. And then it's so famous that it's one of those paintings you know, even if you've never visited it, it's everywhere. And when I was going through and very carefully figuring out, what painting belongs at what point in this story, I knew I wanted that painting in there. And so I began writing about it. But in my drafting process, I write really, really fast in a first draft. And so I'm just trying to get it all down. So I was looking at the painting online, which is a really strange experience because on the National Gallery website, you can zoom in to kind of extraordinary degrees.
Oh, wow.
So you can really, really
that's
see
fascinating.
Detail, actually much more than you could if you visited in person. And so I'd written this section about the Arnolfini portrait with this really kind of strange digital copy that had this zoom quality, which was, I think, quite formative for how I kind of thought about the way Grace looks at paintings, because she zooms and she sees in extreme detail, which was informed by the fact that I could zoom in the way that I initially looked at that painting. And then I went to see it and remembered it's tiny. It is tiny. And that really, really threw me, because I had this experience of it feeling massive because I could see it so closely on the screen. It is a really strange painting. It's strange in color, strange in kind of affect and what it depicts, which is this woman who we would assume is pregnant, although perhaps it's just the fashion of the day and, there is ambiguity there. But the thing that is most pleasing to me about it is that it has a mirror in the center.
Oh, yeah. And you must have zoomed infinitely off that mirror.
Into the mirror. And there's two things. The mirror showing what you would assume would be the artist, and in fact does not show the artist, which feels like such a gift to someone who's writing about copy and copyists and fraud. And also that there's text on it, which says Van Eyck was here in the painting, and how kind of extraordinary a claim of authorship and presence of art, of the artist in the art that is. So it has this real appeal. A lot of the there's another de Velázquez at the end, the painting that she copies, the Venus has a mirror too, which is kind of pleasing for Grace because she can't really see faces, she can't see her own face clearly. But that one in particular was a gift because it has this strangeness of you would expect to see an easel and a man with a palette, and you do not see that in that moment.
The novel is brimming with color and the paints that give Grace access to certain palettes as a copyist. We learn about rose madder, sienna, cadmium, Prussian, viridian. Color in the original works as a kind of accelerant to emotion and discovery. How did it come to play such a large role in this story, and what is its value to the narrative as you think about the actual kind of the texture and appearance of these paints?
I think texture is probably the word. That one of the things that it feels almost kind of separate to all other things that I love in fiction is texture. And I just almost more than anything else want a novel to just show me the texture of a dried stroke of oil paint. That's really, these tiny textural gestures in prose are just so thrilling to me. And my favorite writers are writers who live there or dwell there in their prose. So in part, it is just a real, I wanted to make a commitment to texture, which I think maybe feels particularly urgent in historical fiction, where I think it can get lost sometimes, particularly physicality, texture of physicality can get lost. And so I want to be with the paint and I want to be with the color because I want to be with the world as it was and as it is. The other idea I was playing with was about navigation, that I think a lot of people navigate by recognition. And if you are someone who does not navigate by recognizing faces, you find alternative ways of navigating the world, and color might be one. So that the chapter on rose madder, well, again, it's just a gift of a name for paint, isn't it, really?
It sure is, yeah.
I mean, that was the other thing, is these pigments are all just beautifully named. I couldn't really leave them alone, but Rose Madder has a chapter where Grace is just thinking about pink and thinking about particularly, Rose Madder is a pigment that fades very quickly. So she's thinking about pink and she's thinking about impermanence.
And she's having to load it on because she knows it's gonna fade.
Because she doesn't always have, especially early on, she doesn't always have access to the right materials because she's doing this secretly in the house. So she's working with Rose Madder when it is not ideal. But it leads her to these kind of thematic links or links through color to other, especially in that chapter, to physicality, to the body, her sexuality, through color as opposed to through recognition.
Tires matter. They're the only part of your vehicle that touches the road. Tread confidently with new tires from Tire Rack. Whether you're looking for expert recommendations or know exactly what you want, Tire Rack makes it easy. Fast, free shipping, free road hazard protection, convenient installation options, and the best selection of Continental tires. Go to TireRack.com to see their Continental test results, tire ratings, and reviews, and be sure to check out all the special offers. TireRack.com, the way tire buying should be.
At Capella University, learning online doesn't mean learning alone. You'll get support from people who care about your success, like your enrollment specialist, who gets to know you and the goals you'd like to achieve. You'll also get a designated academic coach who's with you throughout your entire program. Plus, career coaches are available to help you navigate your professional goals. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
The Twisted Tale of Amanda Knox is coming to Hulu. In 2007, Amanda Knox was studying abroad in Italy. She had no idea her dream would turn into a nightmare. Inspired by the actual events of her wrongful conviction and 15-year fight for freedom, watch the new Hulu original series, The Twisted Tale of Amanda Knox, on August 20th. Streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney Plus for bundle subscribers. Terms apply.
Yeah, and I found myself struck again and again the ways in which, in the Arnold Feeney portrait, the way in which she will do a kind of Roland Barthes move and say, this is the color that I thought was important to everything, but it's really this color,
Right?
And it's this other facet of color that tells me something, and it's often telling her something about herself. And that's when we get all these like amazing kind of overlays of Grace as copy, Grace as copyist, Grace as searching for originals, but finding comfort in the copy. And that's something I want to talk about. And you've already brought up the sort of the queerness of Grace and Charles, and the fact that they are sort of forced to think of themselves and at first anyway, in society's rhetoric, that they are imperfect copies of what they're meant to be. They're not the original man and woman. They are the invert, the sissy, and they operate under these sort of brands of a false copy. And Grace will say at one point to Charles, "I am like you," almost saying, I am this copy. But however, together they find in a queer platonic partnership that they might kind of slip this noose. And I wondered how you thought about this kind of like queer family, queer contractual thinking through of being able to find agency in a world that sees queer people as poorly made copies.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I also think of the other element of copying and queerness, which is, that a queer couple is a kind of doubling.
Oh, I didn't think of that at all. But
I think of both, but I certainly was thinking about the latter point that I just raised, in particular with Charles. Can I go ahead and just absolutely spoil things? Can I?
Spoil away, yes, because I think you have to talk about Charles and Charles.
Yeah, that they both have the same name. So there are two Charleses in the book, and they are both really called Charles, but they are different Charleses. And I was thinking about queer experience as an experience of doubling, not so much copying, although in part copying. And I think there's a really quite universal experience for people who are just coming into a queer identity, where they might be looking at someone and trying to understand in themselves, do I want to be you or do I want to be with you? That's a sort of quite universal experience of queerness. And I had the really good fortune to meet an American painter called Adriana Farmiga, who, the time I met her, and I think she still does these, was creating these really beautiful pairs of paintings that are they're very small canvases of kind of abstract color that are very similar but slightly different. And she would do them in pairs. And I heard her speak about them as kind of queer portraits. And I was so taken with the idea of the doubling of a queer couple. So that is definitely kind of in the book. And Grace has a sort of, not even really a love interest, but a kind of a sexual / love interest in the book. And she notes the ways that she starts becoming slightly like this woman. And she kind of finds herself imitating her. And she says she feels more like herself when she imitates Ruby. And so I was definitely thinking in those terms. And then there's this other work that the book does where Grace and Charles get married at the end. And they do this in large part to subvert the family's wish to get the money away from Charles. So new Charles has come to try and get the family's money that he feels is owed to him, because it belongs to the man who he feels should have been his spouse. Broadly, that it is his inheritance as far as he's concerned, but the family, of course, would not agree. And Grace ends up being the heir, but by marrying Charles, she funnels it to him anyway. So I was thinking about the passage of money through the novel. Like that's one of the things my horrible and beloved spreadsheet was doing, was tracking money. I had a rule for Grace that every time she acquires money in the novel, she has to get rid of it as soon as possible.
How fascinating.
So if you
have it stolen from...
Oh yeah, it has to leave her kind of immediately. So she yearns for money. Because she yearns for independence, but she is also horrified by it, and she cannot square it ethically with anything that she sees in the world. And so for her, marrying Charles is extremely convenient because it allows her once again to be a conduit. She thinks of herself as a conduit, as a copyist. These paintings pass through her from the original to the copy. And by marrying Charles, she's allowed to be a conduit for the money that it passes through her to Charles. But it is a sort of deliberately strange ending because it ends up being an inheritance novel that ends with a marriage plot. But it's a marriage plot that is a plot in the kind of heist fashion of a plot that is designed to actually subvert the real structures of marriage and inheritance.
Yeah, you've queered the marriage plot, right? With a wonderful hoax. Yeah, and so one of the things that I wanted to talk about is the way in which you give us Charles's story in kind of meeting the man that he would wish that he had the inheritance from through a true love, Matt. And we get this as a kind of, the backstory of a con man, but of a con man with real, authentic, and original feelings of love and connection to a man who he is, in society's eyes, a perversion for loving. And I wondered how those kind of chapters came into being and how you decided where they would exist in the chronology of the novel.
This was what I struggled with most, right? That I knew and I wrote it start to finish, which I think I normally always do. But as I was going, I could feel myself getting deeper and deeper into a hole, which was that I knew that at a certain point, I'm going to have to do quite a lot of quite complicated explaining. And I was getting quite anxious about it and feeling like I don't know how I'm getting really deep into this thing. And I don't know how to get out of this without this sort of what could have been, if I'd approached it the way I thought I had to, a kind of long and clunky series of exposition chapters. Or it was going to have to be letters. And I was really annoyed by letters as a vehicle. I was just getting really antsy about it. And it was just one of those, really wonderful moments of conversation with another writer. I was talking to my good friend, a writer called Daisy Johnson, and she just said, great. She's wonderful, and I owe her a lot because she said, well, why not just tell the story? She kind of looked at me like I was complicating matters ridiculously and said, well, just tell the story when you need to tell it. Why would you hold it back or kind of put it in a letter when you can just go there? There's no rule that says you can't tell the story when you need to tell a story. And so the novel is in the first person in Grace's point of view, except for these shorter sections that are in the third person, and they are with Charles or the two Charleses. And they come when they need to in the book. That is, I suppose, all I can go. That at certain points you can't go on with Grace's story without knowing these certain things. And a lot of the work comes very, very late. And it's almost the end of the book. There are 3 chapters called Charles I, Charles II, and Charles III that talk about the life of and experiences of new Charles. And they came at the point that I needed to say it. And I was gifted the option by Daisy of just saying it.
Well, I like that very much as an explanation. And no, before I let you go, I'd love to know a little bit about what you've been reading and loving recently, and maybe get some recommendations from you for books we should be picking up.
Well, one of these that immediately springs to mind, I think I'm late on and everyone else read before me, but I am in the middle of Demon Copperhead, Barbara Kingsolver, and finding it extraordinary. As is kind of obvious from this conversation, I have this really deep and slightly convoluted relationship with the Victorian novel. And I'm trying really hard to with the book I'm writing now, it's not a historical novel. In fact, it's set in the future. And I was kind of thinking this is going to be my step beyond a Victorian novel. And at a certain point, I looked at my wife and said, hey, you know what? I've just realized I think this novel that I'm writing that is set in the next century in rural Wales. I think it's actually, it's about David Copperfield. And she sort of rolled her eyes and said, well, you've got to read Demon Copperhead, which I am duly doing and finding it absolutely staggering. And it's one of those novels that is truly extraordinary on its own merits. But when for someone who knows David Copperfield very well and loves David Copperfield, it's staggering the way that those two books are talking to each other. Just really, really bafflingly brilliant as an achievement.
I can't recommend enough listening to it as well. If you have any interest in the audio version, it's one of the best audiobooks of the last decade, I think.
Oh, fascinating. Well, I will definitely do that. The other book that immediately springs to mind is Glyph by Ali Smith. Ali Smith is probably my favorite living writer. I think she's absolutely extraordinary. And, we were talking earlier about texture and about kind of the flourish of texture. And she is someone who does it so extraordinarily. And Glyph came out last year. And it was one of those moments of reading a novel, the absolute perfect time. I started reading it the day after the US election results were announced.
Oh, wow.
And in a state of, as you can imagine, as everyone was, extreme disorientation and fear. And it was a novel that spoke to me so clearly and horrifyingly and reassuringly. And above all, it is a consoling novel about fear. It's a dystopian novel, I suppose, but I found it to be just absolutely beautifully consoling amongst everything else. So I recommend that all the time.
I need that very much right this moment.
Me too.
Ali Smith, have you read her Seasons?
Yes.
I remember reading, still in the midst of COVID, this book she had written grappling with COVID. And I just didn't understand. Was that winter? I can't remember.
It must be. I get that, yeah.
But I just couldn't understand the ability to bring in the world of our exact moment and to give it this fictional life in such a both authentic but transformative way. And I always appreciate her for that.
Yeah. I mean, she thinks so quickly is why. I've never seen anyone think as fast as she does.
I'm both jealous and daunted by that.
Absolutely.
But the book I really want to recommend today is the original by Nell Stevens. You've given this brand new chapter to a hoax and a historical impossibility that I'll never be able to see the Tichborne hoax again without thinking about Grace and Charles and the original. And I thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much. And in particular for reading and thinking about it so carefully. It's a huge privilege to be read that way. So thank you.
Well, that's all from me for now. My thanks to Nell Stevens for coming on to talk about her latest brilliant novel, The Original. It's really one of my favorites of the year. You can find links to purchase The Original and all of Nell's recommended books at the website, burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a podcast t-shirt, and ways to get in contact. As you listen, take a moment to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, and now YouTube, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this has been Burned by Books.